ESG has become a part of the culture wars in the US. Essentially, the idea that businesses and investors should consider environmental, social, and governance criteria was popularized about 20 years ago. Now, ESG is a pretty slippery term. It can mean many different things to many different people. What some see as the democratization of capitalism for all stakeholders, others really view as woke capitalism. And it's important because it's grown in popularity. There's nearly 3 trillion in net assets that are invested globally in sustainable funds. And many big companies are reporting ESG information and are also being rated on their ESG performance. There is, however, in the past few years, a rising backlash against ESG, particularly in the US. And it's reached quite a frenzied level in the last couple of years as we enter into this current election cycle. So today I'm joined by 2 men, one from either side of the political divide, who've been working together to drill into this controversy in an effort to take some of the heat out of the argument and to try and chart a path that could be acceptable to both the left and the right. So we've got with us today Dan Crowley, who's a card-carrying Republican, and Bob Eccles, a lifelong Democrat. So maybe, Dan, if we can start with you. There's been a lot of action on this issue recently, and I'm just wondering if you can give us a quick summary of what you think are the important events for understanding the situation.
Well, sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you. I think you alluded to it in your introduction. These issues have been evolving for the past 20 years or so. The modern era, though, in terms of the controversy, really can be traced back to the beginning of the Biden administration and a series of orders that were signed that reflect his policy priorities. And if you distill everything that President Biden has said or done since being sworn in, they really boil down into 2 big buckets. One of them is climate change, and the other is social equity and all of the implications of that. And I think to a very great extent, the developments, the anti-ESG developments, are largely a Republican reaction to the Biden policy agenda. And so it has become very much a proxy war for a bigger, broader debate over the role of government. And we'd be happy to discuss what ESG is and what it is not, because I think it's as important to understand what it is not, particularly when we're talking to policymakers.
Okay, so maybe if we go over to Bob then. So can you tell us sort of what ESG isn't and what it is?
So when Dan and I first started working together, we wrote a little piece for the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance called Turning Down the Heat on the ESG debate, separating material risk disclosures from salient political issues. And that's really the essence of it. So I think, to the extent that the Republicans have differences of opinion with the Biden administration about climate policies, about, social equity, I mean, those are fair things to talk about. But I think that has been confounded with what it's been called ESG. What ESG is, it's basically about material risk factors that matter to value creation. And that's what SASB was all about. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board that I was the founding chairman of. That's what companies are focused on. That's what investors are focused on. And so in some ways, and really, in the beginning with that Who Cares When's report that you referred to earlier, 20 years ago, that's really how it started. But it's been captured on the right by confounding it with woke and saying it's a political agenda. Ironically enough, it wasn't the right that first objected to ESG. The first people to really start objecting to ESG were what I call the sustainability Taliban. That's the extreme of my side. Dan's got the sustainability flat earthers. They didn't like ESG because it was only about value creation for companies. And it wasn't about making the world a better place, what they would call true sustainability, not ESG. So you've got this ironic situation where you've got one group of people screaming about ESG because it's only about value creation with companies. And you've got another group screaming that it's a political agenda that's interfering with the value creation by companies. And so when you get to that point with ESG, the term is probably not useful anymore.
I guess that's an interesting point. I mean, it is. What would be a good term if you just material risks?
Yeah, I think if we brought this down to, and Dan can weigh in because this is, I've talked about this from the beginning. If we talk about materiality, material risks that investors and companies have to focus on, And if we talk about the fiduciary duty of company board directors, and investors, the fund trustees, that covers it. And a lot of the things that you see, the back and forth between the Trump and the Biden administration on risks and stuff, these are these little differences in language that substantively aren't all that important. What is pecuniary? I'm good with pecuniary. Republicans like pecuniary. Democrats like, economically relevant factors. We're talking about the same things, but in this polarized political environment, people are trying to use this to try and maximize differences rather than recognize whether they like it or not. There's a lot of commonalities.
I agree with that. And I think, the big problem with ESG is from the perspective of the Republican Party, it sounds like something a tree hugger came up with. And that's why I've stopped using ESG. I talk about sustainability, which from my perspective is unassailable. It ought to be taught in every business school. It's about long-term value creation. And so I've stepped away from talking about ESG, but when we're talking about sustainability, and in particular disclosures that are important to investors, the thing to remember is that what we're talking about are disclosure of risks that are known to management. This is not an exercise in making up data or finding things to report. This is what our corporate disclosure laws are all about, which is giving investors information that is known to management about material risks that could affect their investment decisions. That's what this all boils down to. And that, of course, changes over time. It evolves along with portfolio theory. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is disclosure of financial risks that are material to investors. It's really that simple.
I mean, rules and the SEC rules require that as a basis now, but I guess there has been some debate about whether that's being included enough. A lot of companies are including the ESG information in varying degrees, but there is a question about how reliable or comparable it is. And so we've seen these push from various standard setters. In California, most recently, the SEC is working on theirs, as well as the International Sustainability Standards Board, and in Europe. Is that sort of the nub of this, of getting into companies to have some standardized mandatory reporting that is comparable? Do you think that's a key point here, or a key way forward?
Why don't I kick that off, Bob, and then you can follow it. Certainly mandates are a big thing in Europe, but in the U.S. it's important to recognize that something like 85% of the S&P 500 have voluntarily adopted TCFD and are attempting to make sustainability disclosures. The challenge for investors is that the information is not standardized, therefore it's not comparable. And there's an urgent need, and it's being driven largely by institutional investors, but others, market participants and regulators, are looking to establish a global baseline for the sustainability disclosures. And I think, when we're looking at what makes America capital markets the greatest capital markets in the world, why are we the envy of the world, and what can other people do to emulate U.S. capital markets, I would suggest that it is investor confidence in the integrity of corporate disclosures and their willingness to commit scarce capital based on those disclosures that is the backbone of our system. Generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, U.S. GAAP, really is the crown jewel of our capitalist system. And I'm excited by the prospect for the International Sustainability Standards Board to play the same role on an international stage with private sector experts. These are people, not just CPAs, but leading people from accounting firms, academia, other experts who work together with other private sector experts with input from stakeholders over an extended period of time to come up with the right standard. I think that's the best approach because it incorporates the U.S. voluntary adoption of TCFD as well as the European mandate to adopt CSRD. I think ISSB can be the bridge between the two. So we will continue to have voluntary adoption in the U.S. that satisfies both the SEC climate risk disclosure rule requirements as well as CSRD and maybe even the California statutes, which seem very comparable to CSRD.
Look, I think Dan is right. I mean, the key phrase is global baseline. Right? You've replaced a bunch of NGOs, GRI and SASB and CDP and CDSB and IRC and TCFD. So now you have, the ISSB that Dan had talked about, and they've issued two disclosures, general requirements and climate. You have EFRAG issued, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. There's, I think, 12 of those. What you need to have is when there's a common issue like climate, and then include the SEC rule when it comes out. As Dan said, investors are global. So, they don't want to have different sets of requirements. They want apples to apples comparisons like they do with financial information. And the importance of the U.S. investment community is not to be underestimated. 9 of the top 10 asset managers in the world are based in the United States. And another little fun fact, the other day I was doing something. Of the 100 largest companies in the world by market cap, 62 are in the United States, 11 are in China, and 5 are in France. So you can have all of these international things going on, and unless they're really embraced on a voluntary basis, as Dan was talking about, they're really not going to go anywhere. And I think what you've got with the CSRD is there's this whole kind of financial or single materiality versus double or impact materiality. The CSRD is heavy on impact materiality, which is a focus on negative externalities. They don't talk much about how they're related or not to value creation. And it's a government, and if it wants to issue a rule like that, it can do so. It'll apply to a lot of U.S. companies, and there's going to be some friction on that, I think. But from the point of view of what Dan and I are talking about and where you can find common ground between Democrats and Republicans, it's having this global baseline on material issues and having a set of standards to report on them. Where the politics come in is whether or not you think the SEC has got the authority to issue a climate disclosure rule, even, keep it to just scope 1 and 2. But then you still have this issue of underlying standards, and I think they do, and we'll see how it sorts out. I think, whatever the SEC does, there's so much pressure from the investment community, and the corporate community recognizes this. I think kind of the de facto standard is going to turn out to be the work of the ISSB. Maybe I'm just being optimistic, Dan. What do you think?
Well, I think, for one thing, the SEC very clearly does have the authority to promulgate corporate disclosure. They've done it since 1934. The only real question on the U.S. side is whether Scope 3 is outside of their delegated mandate from Congress under EPA versus West Virginia. And that's an open question, and I think they're struggling with that, which is why the rule hasn't been issued. But at least CSRD in Europe, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is a disclosure-based regulatory regime, in contrast to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which clearly goes much further and would be highly problematic, has extraterritorial reach on U.S. companies, and I don't think folks have really woken up to the potential impact that would have if it is finalized. Now, it may very well not survive the trialogue process, and we have an election coming up in Europe in the spring, and we may never get back to it. But folks should pay attention to CS3D, because if it were adopted by the U.S. Congress, it would almost certainly be declared unconstitutional in the U.S., and yet they currently plan to try to have it apply to U.S. issuers that do a certain amount of business in Europe. So just want to say that is not a disclosure directive, but CSRD is, and I think the SEC inevitably does have the authority to issue the climate risk disclosure rule and will, but it will likely differ from what the Europeans have or what they have in Canada or Japan and elsewhere. And that's why it's so important to have the global baseline. Regulators, policymakers can build on top of that. They can have additional requirements, but at least investors globally will have a floor below which disclosure will not fall.
If I could just build a little bit on what Dan said, in the original formulation of the CSRD, there was something called the rebuttable presumption, which basically said report on everything until you can convince us that you don't have to. That was reversed, and so now there's a materiality requirement, and it's defined a little bit differently, but that's important, right? So even in Europe, it's like if it's material, you've got to report on it. The distinction between the CSRD and the CSDDD that Dan was talking about is important, because what you've got in the CSDDD is this is basically telling companies how they should be managed. These are the things you need to do. You need to have these policies and procedures and practices, and your boards have to do that. And I think that's a big reach by the government. And I think it's the wrong way to frame it. So if you want to change the role of the corporation in society, and Dan and I have talked about this before, you're not going to do it, I don't think, through that. Then go change company law. And if Europe wants to change company law to have something like a public benefit corporation, whatever they call it, in France, they've got, the Mission Entreprise, whatever it is, don't speak French. They can do that, but then that will be company law in Europe, and you're not going to put that company law on U.S. companies. And with the CSDDD, it's this kind of weird hybrid thing in between.
If they want to change U.S. law, that's fine, but what it does implicitly is change Delaware corporate law.
Yeah, I think from my understanding, the CSDDD remains quite controversial even in Europe as well. There's a lot of kickback, so I can see how there's a lot more to go before that gets to anywhere near coming through for laws. I think maybe if I just sort of take a step back from that, I mean, it's an interesting caution, but you both seem to be aligning around the idea that climate reporting and the ISSB forming some sort of global baseline is potentially this sort of less dramatic, more calm middle ground that the left and the right could potentially coalesce around. I guess I had a question for you, though, because there's a lot of other initiatives that have happened in the States in different state laws, and there's still a lot of rhetoric that's happening despite the ISSB sort of coming through and that global baseline being established. So maybe if we can just turn back to the US and around the anti-ESG movement, how much do you think of what's going on is political theater, and how much, what should companies or investors really be thinking about or worrying about as some of the real world implications of what we're seeing going on there?
Yeah, I think it is mostly political theater and largely driven by people who really don't understand the issues, particularly in the red states. We're seeing some proposals that are either nonsensical or just fine. They don't do what the proponents think they will do. And where they are problematic, they're finding that the state treasurers are coming back and saying what you're trying to ask us to do by law is inconsistent with our fiduciary duties. And so you're starting to see the inevitable happen, which is that Republicans are sort of running out of runway on the anti-ESG rhetoric. I think, right now it's all about the election 2024. And by the time we get there, the market forces will have continued to evolve. And that's what's really important to keep in mind. If you're a CFO or a CEO of an issuer, is that this movement really is being driven primarily by investors for investors, and that will continue to happen no matter what the regulators do. In a very real sense, the European regulators are ahead of their markets, trying to establish mandates that compel behavior. And the U.S. regulators are really playing catch up to where their markets already are. As we've talked about, 85% of the S&P 500 are already making sustainability disclosures. The SEC is still waiting to come out with its first sustainability disclosure rule, the climate risk disclosure rule. And clearly, U.S. companies are very far ahead of where the SEC is. And so if I were an issuer executive, I would be focused on what the markets are doing and pay a lot less attention to policymakers and the political rhetoric, because that will sort out over time. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about are market forces, capitalism, and the continuous evolution and innovation that benefits investors and, again, makes us the greatest capital markets in the world. I think policymakers should study what makes us great and double down, rather than trying to emulate Europe or take us in a different direction.
So I guess there's two things about that, Rochelle. There's some good news and there's some bad news. And the good news is that, really nothing's changed in America in terms of what companies are doing. Maybe they're a little bit more quiet, they're a little bit more disciplined, but are they changing their basic resource allocation decisions, strategies, dealing with climate change as a risk factor? No, they aren't. Same thing on the investor side. I think there's some products that were issued that we claim too much. So it's not really had any material effect in terms of what the corporate community and investment community do. It's been a little bit confusing and annoying. The bad news is that this is kind of, as Dan said, running out of steam. DeSantis was trying to make this a plank to run for, president in the Republican primary. Hasn't gotten very far. Rochelle, I've made a meal out of this anti-ESG thing, thanks to the red states and the Freedom Caucus people. It's like an endless number of pieces on Forbes.com, this low-hanging fruit, it's crazy stuff these people have been doing, and it's going away. And it's like, Dan, I don't know what I'm going to write about. This is running out. What am I going to do, man?
Well, maybe we'll get past talking about climate and talk about other very significant issues like, plastics in the ocean or human capital practices. There are a lot of other dimensions to ESG, and we haven't even talked about the governance piece, which of course is how institutional investors express their preferences on major policy issues to corporate management through the proxy process. That's all very important as well. So I don't know. We probably don't have too much time left, but certainly.
But that's a good point Dan made. We're getting past ESG and we're talking about specific issues: climate, plastics, forests, human capital. And if we can get to those, and then that's where you can have substantive conversations across the aisle. And the ESG thing, it's like, forget about it.
Do you think that's a way to take some of the bluster out of this as well? When you actually get down to a very specific issue, do you expect that if we have conversations about biodiversity or about water or about human capital, that those could get caught up in the politics again? Or do you expect them to be a bit more fact-based?
I mean, look, there's always politics and there'll be differences of opinion, and again, you need to kind of keep clear the distinction Dan and I wrote about in the beginning, which is what are the policy issues where there's differences of opinion? What are the disclosure issues, the material risk factors that companies know about that, investors should know about and should be disclosed? But you're not going to have the same kind of just crazy, sort of culture war when you talk about specific issues as you get with this amorphous thing called ESG, where people can call it whatever they want it to be and then rage on about it.
I think politics will always be a part of it. I mean, let's face it, every industry that has objected to a new FASB rule has rushed to the hill to try to undermine the process by politicizing it. And I think that's really important to remember as we go into this new era of developing sustainability standards. It's really important that we keep politics out of it because we don't want either side's political ideology to influence what is being disclosed. What's being disclosed should be material information from the standpoint of the investor. What are the risks I need to know about to decide whether to invest or to divest, or if I'm not going to divest, what's the best way to engage as a shareholder with the company?
So if you had the sort of roadmap on your desk and you could pick the next issue or two that you think should be addressed in terms of sustainability, what would be on your wish list?
Well,
Dan, you want to go?
Yeah, a number of us have been waiting for years for the SEC to issue a human capital disclosure rule. And we understand that they're working on two. One of them has to do with diversity in the corporate boardroom. The other one has to do with metrics around your HR practices. But human capital is one of the most important ingredients to any successful enterprise. And there have been petitions pending at the SEC for years and rumors of a rule, but so far nothing.
Bob, any differences there, or you would be the same?
No, I would agree with that. So let me go outside the SEC. So if I had to pick something that I think would be important to happen, and this illustrates like disclosure can only do so much. And if we're going to stay on climate for just a second, what I would love to see, and I think you could get there, some bipartisan conversation about putting a price on carbon.
100% agree. There's no amount of disclosure that will meaningfully move the needle on greenhouse gas emissions. If that's the objective, you have to harness macroeconomic forces either through carbon pricing or a carbon tax, something along those lines.
Ooh, I think that's a whole other panel, gentlemen. Thank you so much. It's been brilliant. Brilliant to speak to you both and to learn a bit more about this. Thank you.
Good to see you, Rochelle. Thanks again.